Hey, everybody. Welcome back. I have a very special guest today. As you can see, anybody who's paying attention on Substack and anybody paying attention at all to the energy markets knows who the green chicken is or knows of Doomberg. So my very special guest today, thanks very much for being on Doomberg. I really appreciate your time.
Hey, it's great to see you again, my friend. I'm looking forward to it.
Excellent. Yep. Thank you. And so I ran into Doomberg. We had a chance to speak at a fairly exclusive conference in the hills of Maryland, if you will. And it was a fascinating presentation that you did, but also just very interesting talking to you outside of that about, first of all, your business model, because this has to do with everything that we're going to talk about afterwards. But, it's worth bringing up. I had a good chuckle to myself when I saw and had a chance to speak with you before your presentation, actually, that effectively what you've done is bring some honesty to the energy markets. This is very interesting to me, but I think a lot of people paying attention to, it's like if you have 3 brain cells that still work and function, that a lot of the stuff you're being told about green energy and windmills and solar is going to replace oil and gas and all the rest has to be false, right? And then people inside the energy sector itself, inside the energy industry, who actually, have to look at things like profit and loss and who can't really afford to lose billions of dollars on boondoggles, are of course much more honest about what's taking place. Would you just talk about the inspiration behind Doomberg? You don't have to get that deep into it, but this is a very unique thing that you've done. And essentially your whole business model is based on telling the truth when nobody else will.
Yeah, I think if you take a step back and you look at the energy discourse as it exists in the Western world for the past 10 to 20 years, it has been dominated by politicians, most of whom have no sort of formal scientific training. And then many of the scientists involved sort of work in universities. Largely missing from the discourse was the sort of scientifically trained industrial voice. And that's because most of them are hidden behind public affairs teams and investor relations teams. And, if you're an employee at ExxonMobil or Chevron, you're not going to be given the opportunity to speak much in the mainstream media. You're supposed to play the role of villain and do so quietly. And then B, you're not even going to do it anyway because you're afraid of upsetting your investors or losing funding from the government or just saying the wrong thing. And that is a significant void in the public discourse that we have, through a combination of luck and a lot of hard work, have been able to exploit, I guess is the word. That has a bit more of a darker meaning than I mean it here.
Yes.
We took advantage of a void in the marketplace and have created hopefully a compelling product that has achieved product market fit, to steal a vernacular from the startup world. And
Exactly.
so we speak about energy from the lens of science and industry. Ultimately, physics, when you say the truth, I just say physics. Physics dictates what's possible and what's not. One of the things about the energy markets that makes them so fun to analyze is they are tantalizingly predictable. There are certain things that in the long run must be true. We could, filibuster our way through reality for a certain period of time, but ultimately physics dictates what must be done. And with the lens of physics, you can at least understand what the sort of thermodynamic end state has to be, the kinetic transitions and the frictions thereof notwithstanding, but at least, and from an investor perspective, that's pretty rare, right? Where you actually have, for example, you could calculate an equilibrium price of oil today, and then you could have that in the back of your pocket as to what oil should really be trading for in a truly free market. Oil's not a free market, but at least you have some guideposts, some indicators, and you do this long enough and you see some odd things happening in the market, and then maybe you could take advantage of it. And so we create content. We're a paid subscription model. We don't sell ads and we don't do sponsorships, so we're not beholden to anybody editorially. All of our subscribers are precious, but none particularly so. It's a joke that we like to say around the office, because if somebody unsubscribes because they don't like a piece, I mean, that's their right. The market will dictate to us how well we're doing. So it's been really fun. The conference you referenced was a blast. It was great to meet you. We rarely do those, of course, but we made an exception to do this one, and it was a good time.
Bravo. Yeah. We were super happy that you were there. I know I wasn't the only person. It was pretty star-studded. In fact, I want to touch on some of the other people that were there if we have time. George Gilder in particular. I just finished up his book, and he's very much his book on wealth and poverty echoes exactly what you've just said, which is no model anywhere has been designed ever that really can take the place of or shove aside the value and the importance of the free market, and whether that's a free market in understanding about what's happening in the energy markets or the energy markets themselves. To the extent that they are free, they will continue to generate wealth and keep us going. But I want to pull on that thread a little bit and just follow up with, and so what are some of the things that you said that were particularly truthful, right? At a time when nobody's really saying these things, because again, right, like you said, if you're a low-level flunky at ExxonMobil or any of these places, you are damn sure not going to be promoted for telling what's really happening in the energy space. And you talked about the four truths of oil, which I thought were sort of worth just, I mean, quickly, right, in bullet form, right? First of all, right, it's life, right? This is the basis of our civilization. You want to just run through these real
Sure.
quick, just the four
Yeah.
truths. You don't have to elaborate too much, but I think it's worth repeating because nobody's saying this right now.
Yeah, small correction. It's the four laws of energy.
Four
Oil
laws.
is, yeah,
Yes.
and
Excuse me.
oil is
Yep.
just one subset, an important one of energy. I'll say what those four laws are. They are sort of the axiomatic basis of our framework of analysis. These are the things that must be true, that we know to be true. Betting against these things is foolhardy, and the consequences and the sort of postulates that flow from those four axioms is testimony to the scientific way that we attack problems. So the first is energy is life. Every human everywhere wants a higher standard of living. That's like a fundamental truism. And the human endeavor is a constant, unrelenting struggle against the forces of entropy. You cannot have a great standard of living without wasting an enormous amount of energy. You cannot impose order without wasting heat. This is thermodynamics. These are fundamental laws of the universe. And all humans everywhere want a higher standard of living, which means the arc of energy demand is forever up and to the right. The second law is energy is fungible. You don't really care where the electrons come from that are powering the lights when you flip the switch. Hydroelectricity, coal-fired plant, natural gas plant, nuclear plant, lights come on, you're happy. Electric bill is affordable, you're happy. Electric bill is super cheap, you use a lot more energy, you power AI servers, you plug in refrigerators, but you don't really care where it comes from. Shortages of one will be met with supply from another. Engines will be switched, investments will be made, arbitrages will close. The third law of energy is that the energy companies are technology powerhouses. They regularly perform acts of technology that would be indistinguishable from magic. If you just look at the shale revolution, we're right at the edge of peak oil, the global financial crisis, oil jumps up to $140, and like magic, horizontal drilling happens. And these companies will drill themselves out of business, by the way. They have no discipline. Drill, baby, drill is the natural tendency of these people, and they incinerate enormous amounts of shareholder capital in pursuit of growth. They are giant deflationary machines. Now, the last law of energy, which sort of closes the loop, is electricity and energy prices are highly inelastic. So it doesn't take much in the way of a shortage for prices to spike, and it doesn't take much in the way of a glut for prices to crash, because if we have more oil, say, than we have engines to burn, you want to get rid of that oil, and prices collapse. And so we've seen in the span of a year, prices go from minus $37 a barrel to 120, and back down again to the 50s and 60s. Small headlines, small perturbations in supply, demand, and headlines that threaten to risk such perturbations can drive a substantial price imbalances. And just to give you one strong example of this, in the aftermath of the opening phases of the war in Ukraine, oil was trading in the 120s. President Joe Biden was staring down the barrel of a midterm election and released 1 million barrels a day from the strategic petroleum reserves, which is 1% of daily supply. He did this for 6 months, and in those 6 months, the price of oil was cut in half. And that just shows you. So when you take those four things, energy is life, energy is fungible. The energy companies are deflationary machines, and prices are inelastic. Then you can look at the world through that lens and develop really good heuristic models to understand what's going on.
Yeah, this piece on energy is fungible. I have to laugh. So I'm in Puerto Rico. Like we would love it if the lights did go on when we hit the switch. It's funny. I actually had the guys out here, the engineers out at my house yesterday, looking at the roof. Where are we going to put the solar system? Where do the panels fit and all the rest? And the power went out like 7 times yesterday. So I mean, what you're saying about sort of these truisms about the reality of the energy world. I mean, we're living at a time, I don't know if there has been a time when there's been this much denial of
Yeah.
reality, and that reality will have to discipline from both directions. I mean, there's so much what do they call it now? Mis and disinformation, right? About almost everything, right?
So
Right now. So
let me give you an example of how you could take these 4 axioms and come up with what we call Doomberg's postulate, which is a totally counterintuitive way to look at the world from the sort of traditional climate-aware, climate-alarmed Western mainstream media. Doomberg's postulate goes as follows. Every molecule of fossil fuel produced in the world will be burned by somebody somewhere, and local restrictions against such activities merely switch who gets to enjoy that privilege. And your example is a perfect one. If Europe eschews coal and Puerto Rico builds a coal-fired power plant, and suddenly your electricity is stable and reliable and good baseload power, Europe no longer burning coal means that you'll just burn coal for a modestly lower price because there's just less demand for it. The gating function of carbon emissions is production, not demand, because on a long enough time horizon, demand is infinite because everybody everywhere wants a higher standard of living. You would pay much more than the average US consumer pays for stable baseload power to your home that never goes out.
I am paying for it.
Yeah, and you're not even getting it, right?
And we're not even getting it, which is the point, which is,
well,
hence the need for solar on Puerto Rico.
Right. We're publishing a piece a little after we finish recording this on natural gas and how natural gas will be the bridging fuel to power AI, and we're making a pretty bullish call on natural gas. We open that piece by saying, like, what is electricity worth? It's not what the average person in a stable economy that has sort of table stakes, very high reliable grid. It's not what they pay for. It's not worth that. It's worth way more than that. And it's worth way more than that because if you didn't have it, you'd be willing to pay a lot more to get it. And in fact, because we pay a token amount based on how much we use, it's easy to confuse list price with value.
Yep.
And that's just one of the mirages of the Western world that has allowed themselves to become confused about how the energy markets work. I mean, if you're a high school student today who's been bathed in sort of climate propaganda, you think energy comes from a light switch and food comes from a phone, and drivers come from an app, and the liquids inside the car you just got in to take you from the shopping mall back home, you don't give much thought to because you've just never experienced the world of shortage, artificial or otherwise. It's only during times of shortages do you really find out what the value of things are. And the value of energy is basically infinite. So
yeah, it's that there's so much truth in everything that you just said that it's hard to know. Sort of, I'll let that statement stand by itself. But yeah, again, like we're living at this time. People have called it a post-truth world, and my point on that would be, well, we're about to find out just how much the truth actually does matter. And the energy markets are obviously a really good example of that. So I also wanted to I wanted to segue into, oil prices talk about inflation and oil now, because we know that the price of oil is actually going down. This to me was, I just never put these thoughts together, but obviously the value of our money and the purchasing power of the dollar is obviously wasting away and about to get much worse, I imagine. But oil prices continue to go down. So not only is the dollar buying less, but the nominal price of oil continues to fall. And so this myth that somehow we're in this scarcity situation, the scarcities are all primarily the result of essentially bad management, bad government, and bad behavior by people running things.
Yeah. So let me dig into this a little bit. We wrote a piece last year, relatively controversial, I suppose, called Peak Cheap Oil is a Myth. And the overlap in the Venn diagram of people who think peak cheap oil is just around the corner and that the government is lying about inflation data is basically a circle. Everybody who thinks peak cheap oil is coming also thinks the US in particular is lying about inflation data. Well, both of those things can't be true because the price of oil is $75 a barrel.
Right.
And if you look at the Bloomberg official CPI inflation adjusted price of oil, it's like $23 a barrel today, as cheap as it's been. So one way, if you don't believe the government inflation data, and by the way, we don't, one way to look at the true price of oil is to just plot it in ounces of gold. And gold is stable. That's thousands of years of having durable value preservation. The reason I own gold is because I would like to preserve some value. It's not an investment or speculative medium for me. It's a savings vehicle. One way to measure your net worth is in ounces of gold. And so if you look at how many ounces of gold it takes to buy a barrel of oil, which you can do by simply dividing the price of oil by the price of gold and eliminate the US dollar from your analysis, you'll see a 50-year chart that is mostly downward. It has its spikes in it. There's a mismatch between the capital investment cycle in the energy space and the business cycle in the economy. And sometimes you have shortages and sometimes you have gluts. But there's an undeniable downward trend. And it just so happens right now that the price of oil in ounces of gold has basically never been cheaper. Yep. It's an incredible chart to see. We showed it at this conference. I think that was what you were referring to when you sort of seeing the pieces put together that way. There's nothing on that chart that indicates we're running out of oil anytime soon. And then there's a bunch of other megatrends. There's an enormous amount of oil. The politics is in the way of its development. And in a true crisis, politics would be swept aside. California has just as much oil as Texas. It refuses to drill for it. It has a huge shale, Monterey Shale formation. We wrote a piece about Malay in Argentina and the Vaca Muerta shale. Politics and the history of all of the challenges of operating in Argentina are in the way of developing that field. But we saw a podcast shortly after we published that a subscriber sent to us, where a person who's been basically living in that field for 12 years and is very respected in the shale, horizontal drilling type world. He said that reservoir could easily handle 5 to 6 million barrels a day. Doesn't mean they're going to, but it could. There's huge resources in Canada, Venezuela, Guyana, offshore, and then there's the whole concept of natural gas and the blurring of what the actual definition of oil is, which we can get into, but we are swimming in hydrocarbons. We're never going to run out of them. From a perspective of a modeler looking out for the next 50 years, you should model the resource base as infinite, and then allow your assumption of how politics will evolve to toggle production, and then production will be the gating function of emissions and demand. And that's just the way the world works.
Yeah. Well said. That's well tied together. A group that I have several sources, people actually looking to invest in Vaca Muerta. They tell me that Chevron and Halliburton and the big boys have billions of dollars of equipment down there. And that field looks like, right, it's really about to ramp up. And the reason I know that, or the reason I believe that that probably is the case, is it's an investing group, not unlike the one that we were meeting with when we met. They are looking to invest in infrastructure. The people at that field have to drive something like 5-hour round trip to get there. There's just nobody in the desert to pump the oil. That's the big bottleneck right now. And obviously Argentina's on the way up. So what you say is true, and Venezuela you mentioned too, but again, politics standing in the way of all of this. Talk about, I mean, the interesting thing about this, and you said you're going to publish something here shortly, and I advise everybody to be a subscriber of Doombergs. There really is no finer letter on any topic on Substack right now. It's just excellent. We'll make sure the link is below this recording, obviously, for those of you who want to get a piece of that. It's a very reasonable subscription as well to get some great information on what's happening and just a heavy dose of truth. But where I was going with that is you said natural gas is going to be the bridge fuel, right, for all of these AI powered and I want to end up with a talk on nuclear, or just get your thoughts on nuclear and what's happening at that recent meeting. But talk about what's happening with natural gas. I mean, there's a huge arbitrage in that US natural gas is very cheap. The rest of the world, it is not. We have all of this. How is this bridge going to happen? Like, how is that? How do you see that playing out? And are there obvious investment implications that people can obviously get from you?
Yeah, let me set the table a bit.
Yep.
One of the things we failed to mention about peak cheap oil is the fact that on top of how cheap it is right now, you have to also understand that it is a managed market. There's a giant cartel in the middle of it that is trying to keep prices higher than they otherwise would be. And that cartel, of course, is OPEC. Because OPEC has been keeping the price of oil artificially high, and because one of the major and most prolific shale patches in the US, the Permian, has an enormous amount of associated natural gas with it, we're getting this glut of natural gas in the US. Oil is expensive, and therefore it's lucrative to drill for it, and you get all this natural gas that comes with it, and you got to do something with it, and we're pipeline constrained, and we can't give it away. And for large periods of time in 2024, at the Waha hub in the Permian, the price of natural gas was negative. Like, if you could take it off our hands, we'll pay you. This has become especially true as flaring and methane leaks have been really, cracked down upon. COP28 was one of the big, industry commitments to eliminate, methane flaring and methane venting in particular. And so you have to put it somewhere. And right now, Henry Hub in the US is at about $3 a million BTU natural gas. Well, what does that mean? What does $3 per million BTU mean? Well, if you multiply that number by 5.8, we'll just use 6 because it's like an easy thing. That's the equivalent of $18 a barrel oil. So you have the cleanest burning hydrocarbon, albeit a little bit difficult to handle. It's a gas, but it's clean. Like, we cook with it in our homes, and we don't have special ventilation. You wouldn't fire up the barbecue in your living room, but you cook in your kitchen with natural gas. It's completely clean. So the cleanest burning hydrocarbon is available at dirt cheap rock bottom prices. And by the way, you can very quickly hook up a gas turbine and make electricity. And we believe that the cheapest, cleanest hydrocarbon is not going to be given away indefinitely. You will see a wave of closed loop electricity production / data center pods, basically. Think of them in that way, where you don't need to worry about grid connections or building out long transmission cables. You literally just burn natural gas on site and power your AI data center right there. Yep. And so that got us thinking, gee, there's all this liquefied natural gas around the world. To put natural gas on an LNG cargo ship requires you to build a multi-billion-dollar facility that chills it to astonishingly low temperatures and makes it a liquid, and you put it on these highly specialized, very expensive cargo ships, and it floats all over the ocean and then gets regasified at some import terminal somewhere. And about like 14% of the world's natural gas produced ends up on a boat like that. And it occurred to us that it might make more sense to just invite the technology companies to intercept that fuel before you go and do all of this hoop jumping. And so, lo and behold, last week, Oracle announces a $6.5 billion investment into where? Well, Malaysia. Malaysia is the fifth largest LNG export producer in the world. It's an energy power that nobody knows about in the West, basically. Having been to Kuala Lumpur multiple times in my life, I can tell you that it is an exceptionally well-run country with
Wow.
very powerful resources, and Oracle is going there. And you see, Google going into Qatar and Google going into Saudi Arabia, which is sitting on a mountain of natural gas. The computers are going to go where the gas is. And there's no country on earth that has more gas than the US. And you're going to see AI data centers coming up in Appalachia and in the Permian. We believe, and we're making a call in this piece, that the oil to gas ratio, which had exploded much higher as gas was cheap in the US, might actually revert back to the energy equivalency ratio of 6. It's currently at 25.
Wow.
That's an actionable idea. How one positions for that is up to everybody in their own individual
Sure.
portfolios. And we might get it wrong, but when you read the piece and you connect the dots that we're connecting in the piece, I think you'll find that it's a pretty reasonable assumption.
That's brilliant. Yeah, I think our host Porter has come to the same conclusion some time ago too. That eventually this was another truism and eventuality that had to play out, much like gravity, right? You could really bet on this.
Yeah,
So we have
things that do the same thing can't sell for different prices indefinitely. And
right.
all of the hydrocarbons do one thing, is they get burned to produce heat that is used to do work.
Yeah, right.
And back to the fungibility issue.
Yep.
If you have the cleanest burning hydrocarbon, also happens to be extraordinarily abundant and dirt cheap. Look at the bottom, Henry Hub, which is the sort of natural gas is traded in like 100 different markets, and some of them are benchmarks. And so the price of natural gas is actually the price at the Henry Hub. At $1.50 a million BTU, that was $10 a barrel of oil.
Yeah.
This is not sustainable. Like,
Yeah. It's like 85% discount. Yeah.
right.
Right.
The engines will be switched. And as I showed in that presentation, in China in April, 30% of the new long haul trucks sold in April of 2024 were powered by natural gas. And that has displaced a significant amount of diesel demand, probably forever, because the Chinese also care about pollution and PM 2.5 in Beijing and Shanghai, and natural gas is far cleaner. It's a much cleaner burning fuel. And so the engines will be switched. Arbitrage is closed forever thus. The people like to draw tangent lines to sine waves. Something is going vertical, it's going to keep going vertical forever. And so as long as you understand the sort of the 4 laws of energy, then you study the markets closely enough, you could come to sort of bettable conclusions.
Yeah, I think also it's an incredibly hopeful message, I think, for a lot of people. Again, we've been hit and bombarded with so much bad news, and the planet's dying, and we got to stop doing this. And there's no question there's a pollution problem, right? There is. I mean, it'd be nice not to throw plastic garbage into the oceans, and if we don't have to burn coal, let's not burn coal. But these things will happen. Your message to me, at any rate, is we have so much of this stuff. And where I'm going with this is not only is it great that all this natural gas is going to be brought to market, the arbitrage between the US, the Henry Hub, and Europe, for example, is going to close. The blowing up of Nord Stream probably helped that along, right? Somebody's business interest there. But also that you mentioned that oil companies, energy companies are essentially tech companies, and what they do is indistinguishable from magic. If you resurrected somebody from, say, the 1700s and showed them what we do to produce energy, it is indistinguishable from actual magic. And can you just can you share with people, like, how is natural gas cooled to whatever it is, 260 degrees below, right?
Yeah.
How does that work at the hub itself when it's condensed into a gas and loaded into a liquid and loaded onto a ship?
You basically just take some small portion of the embodied energy in natural gas to chill it in these giant liquefaction facilities. And then you have these super well insulated circular blobs on these LNG cargo ships. And again, part of the energy is used to maintain, you can't maintain a highly ordered closed system like that without wasting some heat. And so you're wasting some of the natural gas all along the way. But we know how to to manipulate temperature and pressure using energy in order to convert it from a gas phase to a liquid phase. And if you've ever walked through one of these, you just, it feels like you're on another planet. We did an entire presentation on this for our pro tier. We have two tiers. We have our sort of our annual subscribers that get our articles, and then we have a higher tier. And we do a once a month, we call them Doom Zooms webinar, much like the presentation you saw. And we did a whole presentation on natural gas last year called Simple Molecule Complex Markets, a deep dive into natural gas. And that's where we saw the sort of glut of natural gas coming in and caused us to pivot from being sort of bullish energy prices to bearish energy prices. And then that led to various other articles. But yeah, I mean, just forget about the LNG export import facilities. Like if you just go look at the drilling rigs or look at the offshore drilling rigs and what Chevron just announced, 20,000 PSI, operating in 20,000 PSI underwater and successfully and economically bringing oil up from basically, distances under the earth that would have people, as you say, someone in the 1700s would think, what are we doing? Like what is this magic thing? Now, let me say, you said something very important, and this is a distinction with a really big difference. The difference between pollution concerns and climate concerns. Pollution is totally solvable, and it's a scandal that we have it. And if you look at the plastics in the ocean, it's all coming from Asia. Like vast majority of plastics in North America are properly recycled. There's not much in the way of Dutch plastics finding its way into the Philippine Sea. But we know how to do that. That's a solved problem. It's just a matter of allocating the resources and the disciplines and the politics involved to get rid of that. That's a vastly different concern than the climate. And the people that want to make us concerned about the climate often convolute the two on purpose, in the same way that nuclear weapons are convoluted with civilian nuclear energy use, which are two vastly different things, right? And so that's a bit of a rhetorical propaganda sleight of hand that I wanted to make sure I addressed and didn't let just slide by.
No, it's very important. Yeah, it is very important to realize that, again, right, to I think a greater degree than most people realize, the problem is the way that we run our societies. Right. In the end, I mean, you never want to cheer against the government. I mean, it's true that if they would deregulate and this is Gilder's point in Wealth and Poverty. And since he also spoke at the conference, and since I've just read that book, and I don't know how I missed it, right? I thought I was actually fairly educated on people who write about such things, but the man is a deeply well thought out philosopher in that book. And I didn't know that. I thought he was just a futurist. But his point is that you never want to be totally cheering against the government, by God, like they could make things a lot worse. But if they would just deregulate and allow people to solve stuff, and there are solutions, like people are pulling garbage out of the oceans. The Airbnb guy donated a bunch of money, and there's ways to get this stuff done. But again, the governance of the incentive structure, the way things are sort of set up at the governmental level that either incentivizes people toward good behavior or not, right? And most of the time it's the or not version that's the problem. But it's an important distinction that you made. So thank you. But I want to go to, you mentioned in a recent free article, a free post that I saw about the gathering in the Rainbow Room. Now, without giving away anything that you reserve for subscribers, can you talk about what's happening? There was a meeting at Rockefeller Center, and they've decided nuclear is okay, right? At long last, like somebody up high is saying, yeah, we need to do this. We need to do it now. Microsoft just paid $1.6 billion to reopen 3 Mile Island. That's now happening. Things can happen with astonishing speed when the right people are sort of behind them. If you take my meaning on when I say right people, but clearly the demand for nuclear is back. What's happening and what can you share with us?
Yeah, so the piece was called Cometh the Hour, and we talked about a really important meeting that happened on the sidelines of Climate Week, no less, where 14 of the world's largest banks declared that nuclear is sustainable and ought to be qualified for long-term financing in the same way that solar and wind are considered sustainable. Ultimately, we opened that piece with one of my favorite lines, which, given sort of my personal experience in the venture world, is the kind of thing that sticks with you. I wish I could credit who said it to me, but a rock solid adage of the VC world is that all the deals are undersubscribed except for the ones that are oversubscribed.
Right.
And ultimately, investing is nothing but a confidence game. And now that the big banks are saying it's okay to invest in nuclear, you're going to see an avalanche of pension funds and duration matchers come in and get in on these 80-year-long projects. And if they could get, 7-8% return and match the 7 to 8% benefits growth they promised their fiduciaries, well, then they'll go ahead and sign up for that because the big banks are in the deal. And now if you have a combination of government support, big banks, and private investors, everybody wants in on the deals all of a sudden, because then the deal goes from undersubscribed to oversubscribed. And the point of that piece is we believe that was a very significant milestone. And it happened the same week that 3 Mile Island news broke, but we actually think this news is even more important, as stunning as the TMI Microsoft announcement was. This is perhaps even more important when you zoom out and measure over time periods of decades. Nuclear is back in play. I just saw a headline cross the wires that Google CEO is going to go all in on nuclear. So we're seeing the sea change in nuclear, and then this is not inconsistent with the call we just described on natural gas. Natural gas can be quicker, and in fact, the title of the piece is bridge burning, because we're going to burn natural gas as a bridge until we could get the nuclear renaissance complete. It still takes a long time to do nuclear. It's not even clear we can do it in the US. Other countries can. China's cranking out reactors at light speed. But you cannot meaningfully decarbonize the world without a massive nuclear renaissance. And so we will either not decarbonize or have a massive nuclear renaissance or some combination of both.
Did you feel like the announcement that it's now okay to go nuclear, invest in nuclear, right? Did you feel like that was also one of the real inevitabilities? I mean, obviously for a long, long time, people have looked and said, like, we can't possibly be serious about energy independence, security, like any of these things that politicians love to crow about, unless and until nuclear has a much, much bigger role. And obviously we have a decent amount of baseload power in the US. I think it's around 20% running on nuclear, but the Chinese, the Indians, I mean, these guys are building, what are they building? Like 50 reactors each.
Yeah.
And, for us, it's been impossible to do. So was that inevitable?
Yeah, it's been a cornerstone of our writing from the very beginning of Doomberg that you cannot be simultaneously concerned about the climate and opposed to nuclear. There's all manner of propaganda directed against nuclear that is just outrageous. It derives from sort of a Malthusian population control mantra and an ugly history of eugenics from the 50s and the 60s. The very few people listening probably understand that the Sierra Club was basically founded by Malthusians who wanted population control. There's all kinds of nasty books that were written back in the day, profiled in the New York Times, that would be considered deeply racist today. I can think of one literally called, quote, Too Many Asians. Like you couldn't get away with that stuff today, and you shouldn't be able to get away with that stuff because it's ugly and it's abhorrent. Like we can feed and elevate every human on the planet, and it should be our collective shared objective to do that. So you cannot be genuinely concerned about the climate and opposed to nuclear power. And I'll just give you like one canard that when I flip it on its head, usually blows people's minds. So one of the big concerns about nuclear energy is all this nuclear waste, and we're saddling future generations with, 10,000 years of poison. Nuclear waste is actually a gift to future engineers, because in the typical rod of uranium, we only use 5% of the embodied energy before we pull it out, and we could recycle that in fast breeder reactors very easily. It's old technology. Countries do it. One of the reasons we don't, and we don't like to do it, is because it creates some plutonium, and so there's some concern about nuclear proliferation. Well, these are political concerns, political issues. All of this nuclear waste, quote unquote, is not much of it, by the way. I think I saw it would fill an NBA court, 10 meters high, all of the nuclear waste in the US or something. This is a gift. There's so much potential energy, it's usable. Just put it in a fast breeder reactor and plug it back into the power plant. Like, there's an infinite supply of nuclear energy layered on top of the infinite supply of oil and gas and coal, and an infinite supply of sun, rays from the sun. The Earth is not a closed system. We use a minuscule fraction of the embodied energy of sunlight. Even photosynthesis is highly inefficient. And we eat a tiny fraction of all of the sort of photosynthesized plant life on the surface. So like this Malthusian, we're running out of stuff nonsense is being cast aside, and nuclear is being restored. And you know, just one last comment on fusion. You know, everyone gets excited about fusion. Fusion is an unnecessary technology that solves two fake problems. Meltdown risk and nuclear waste, and they're both fake problems. And so you don't really need fusion. Fission works just fine. We figured it out 70 years ago, 80 years ago. If France could build 70% of its grid to be powered by nuclear in the 1970s, then surely we could do it today if we wanted to.
Right, exactly. And small modular reactors?
Again, one of
Necessary,
the frustrations that people who truly understand nuclear often portray is that we are chasing new technology when the old technology works just fine and all of the criticisms against it are made up. And so to the extent that SMRs are a distraction from large modular reactors, which we should be building hand over fist, and when you consider that there's just a finite amount of investor money out there,
Yep.
it can be counterproductive. That's the biggest criticism against fusion, by the way. Now, SMRs do have one sort of unique attribute, which is you make them small enough and you use the latest generations of designs. You can create industrial grade steam. So one of the hardest carbon abatement challenges in the climate debate is how do you displace all those cogeneration facilities that are making both electricity and steam, which are the two ingredients that heavy industry needs. And if you have a brownfield site with decent security around it, you could plop an SMR in the middle of it, and you could switch from burning natural gas to using your nuclear reactor to create both steam and electricity. Not quite as high a grade steam as natural gas is capable of producing, but good enough for a big chunk of the base of the pyramid of emissions that we're looking to abate. So if to the extent that you do care about carbon emissions, that's one glaring example where you should be all for nuclear power. You know, and so, but we'll get there. And by the way, on climate change, like whatever you think of it, it doesn't matter. The world is going to roll the dice on it. So if you think the world is about to end, brace for impact. But and if you think it's a giant scam, then fine. But either way, we're going to run the experiment. And so we're, you know, if you look at 2023, coal set a record, natural gas tied a record, and oil set a record. Like, show me on the chart where solar and wind affected anything. It's just not there.
That's right. Rick Rule makes the astonishing statement and calculation that, you know, with $4.5 billion or $5 billion invested in renewables, we've managed to reduce our reliance on oil, gas, right, hydrocarbons from all the way down from 82% all the way to 81%.
And that's trillions, not billions. If we're only
trillions,
billions.
yeah, trillions. Yeah, exactly. So, but no, what you say, and we're going to wrap up here because I want to respect your time. I really appreciate you coming on. Gilder's book is such a revelation and such a refreshing kind of eye-opening look at sort of what the importance of, you know, we in the U.S. have a historical memory and a past of tremendous productivity, achievement. And, you know, Gilder's whole point, and other people have made it, but I don't think anybody's made it any more articulate than he does in this book. So everybody should rush out and get this book because it really is excellent. He's very, just a really articulate guy. Is that you need a system that allows people to tinker. And the crisis, and I've never heard anybody define the crisis of our time. The crisis of our time is this hyper-regulatory, let's lock down everybody with a nanny state attitude about every damn thing under the sun so that nobody's allowed to generate any kind, because the breakthroughs come from tinkering. The breakthroughs come from, right? We wouldn't have the energy markets that we have today if we had to create them starting today, because you wouldn't be allowed to do it, right? Because and then, you know, you wouldn't be allowed to come up with oil and gas and burn things and build, you know, internal combustion engines, because somewhere along the line, somebody, you know, might breathe fumes or get hurt or something like this. It's a valuable argument, I think, to realize that our real salvation is not energy, it's not nuclear, it's not hydrocarbons, it's the human imagination, and it's our ability to continue to tinker and find ways to just, oh, look at that. I wasn't really looking for this development. I didn't try to invent this, but by God, look at what we just came up with. And that's the real essence of the crisis, is that we're heading into a time when it seems like every institution is trying to lock everything down and prevent tomorrow from happening, because they all have special interests to
Yeah.
protect, and incomes that they want to protect. And the only way out of our dilemma is to lift that and start tinkering.
Yeah, I would say it doesn't stifle it as much as it just drives it underground. And
Yeah,
maybe
amen.
we'll end with just like one great example. We just had this longshoreman strike and at the
Yeah.
ports in the US, and thankfully it was settled.
Yep.
There's a video floating around on Twitter. Maybe you've seen it, of an automated port
Yes.
in China, where it's
In-
basically a bunch of people behind keyboards and joysticks, and there
Yep.
isn't a human on the port. The longshoremen have some leverage, and they used it successfully. This will be the foundation of their ultimate demise.
Yes, exactly.
And others will do the tinkering, and you will be less competitive. And if
That's
we
right.
have a regulatory nanny state in the US, that just means China's innovation agenda is going to accelerate. The US trying to sanction China's semiconductor development is going to accelerate it. It's forever
That's right.
thus. You cannot extinguish the human spirit, be they Chinese people, Russian people, Qataris, Puerto Ricans, Americans, Canadians, Mexicans. The human endeavor is not something we would short. We would look to get long it, and politics is but a temporary constraint to the ultimate realization of the human spirit, which is to grow, to provide a better living for your family and your friends and your communities. And this is, this is the way forward. We're actually pretty optimistic. It's easy to be pessimistic. Doombergs in the name. That's a bit cheeky. Deep down, regression to the mean always happens, and we will be fine.
I've lived long enough to be optimistic myself. I think it's a real triumph in my life, because and thank God for everything you just said, right? That human ingenuity is what it is, right? We're not made to live safely. We're not made to be held back, and that politics is sort of a temporary delay in our ultimate aims. So I think that's a great place to stop. I really appreciate your time. This was fantastic. It was great to meet you. I look forward to everything that you write. I'm sort of waiting for the next thing to come out. So I'll make sure that everybody knows where to subscribe, and make sure to follow Doomberg. Obviously, is really, really worthwhile.
Thank you, my friend. And great to see you again. And it was really nice meeting you in person.
For me as well. All the best.